As sex therapists, we often hear people come in and say, sex was great. And then we moved in together and I couldn't keep an erection. Sex was great. And then we got engaged or had got married or some other form of commitment. And then I couldn't keep an erection anymore, right? It's triggered by a relationship deepening event. And if you have early relational trauma, then what I believe happens is that as you get deeper into the relationship, there is a protective part of the unconscious that creeps in to protect you and says, this feels dangerous. This feels threatening. The more involved I am, the more likely I am to be hurt or abandoned or constrained and suffocated. And so what happens is, as a way to disrupt this connection from going deeper, the penis, in the case of men, speaks. It says, I'm not comfortable here. Something is frightening. Something is threatening here. And it shuts down.
Hey, curious people. You're listening to the Self-Led in Bed podcast, where we explore our fascinating internal sexual landscapes and discover our authentic sexual selves. I'm your host, Patricia Rich, a certified internal family systems and sex therapist, coach, and creator of the Self-Led Sexuality model for healing, pleasure, and empowerment. I've spent the last 30 years helping people to develop fulfilling relationships with themselves and others. If you're ready for some warm, smart, and juicy conversations, me and my parts invite you and your parts to get cozy and settle in. My new course, Introduction to IFS Through the Lens of Sexuality, is enrolling now. You can find a link in the show notes. Today's guest is not only an esteemed leader in the world of sex therapy, a prolific author, and a passionate advocate for Irvin Yalom's existential approach to psychotherapy. He is also a master storyteller who has me on the edge of my seat as we discuss his recent book, The Existential Importance of the Penis, a guide to understanding the sexuality of men. I bring the IFS lens as we discuss how the penis speaks. Dr. Daniel Water is a clinical and forensic psychologist, certified sex therapist, a frequent lecturer at professional meetings throughout North America, and the author of more than 30 professional articles and book chapters. Please be aware that we talk directly about sexual anatomy and acts and death anxiety, especially as experienced by the cisgender men Dan identifies with and treats in his practice. Hello, Dan.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for coming on this podcast. We have not had a chance to have a conversation before, and I was so eager to read your book, and I have so many things I'd love to discuss with you today.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for reading the book. And I'm glad that you liked it. And, I really enjoy talking about the book and sex therapy and the work that I've done. And so I'm really looking forward to it.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So before we dive in, I wonder if you could share with listeners where you're located in the world.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so I've spent most of my professional career in New Jersey, which is where I was born and raised. And then I relocated to Florida about 5 years ago, really during COVID, when that changed everything in terms of how psychotherapy is practiced. And when things went virtually, I took advantage to move down to where more family is now in Florida. And so now I do all my work virtually. I still see mostly people up in New Jersey, but I see people in Florida and some other states as well.
So I have parts that always wake up to other Jersey people because I grew up in New Jersey, and I had never had a professional life there. I'm not far from New Jersey. I'm in Philadelphia, but
Mhm.
it brings up some younger parts of me who lived lived through some highs and lows of coming of age in the state of New Jersey.
Yeah, yeah. Well, as you know, Jersey has its pros and its cons, but I can say, from the sex therapy perspective and a psychotherapy perspective, it's been a great place to practice. It's a very psychologically minded area, and sex therapy has always been welcomed and appreciated, and it's been terrific.
Cool. And do you want to share anything about your identities? Um,
So I'm happy to do that. As I said, I have been practicing sex therapy and psychotherapy for about 40 years or so. I'm a clinical forensic psychologist, married, children, grandchildren, um, and I think I think that covers. I mean, I'm happy to, answer any questions about my background or
mhm,
identity. But that's
mhm.
usually how I think about myself. The most important things to me are family and I love practicing psychotherapy. I've often said that if I had my career to do all over again, there is very little that I would change. I have been really blessed and am very proud to consider that a large part of my identity.
It's funny. I was thinking something similar as I was setting up for our conversation today, Monday morning back to work and saying, I can't believe I get to have the day I'm going to have today.
I
I
know,
just
I know.
am really feel so fortunate to be able to do this. And
Yeah,
I don't introduce myself at the beginning of every episode, but we're a little newer to each other actually. So I'll just share.
yeah,
I am white. I am a cisgender woman. I am in a long-term marriage with a man, but have a more expansive understanding of my own sexuality and gender than that might belie.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, and yeah, I love teaching, and this has felt like I guess, and we'll get into our topic pronto here, but there's, well, this is about sex and sexuality, and I think it's really funny.
Mhm.
This was sort of coming to me without thinking about your topic as much, but I think it will tie in, which is that when I work with sexuality, it's not just about like sex, right? Like a lot of people, understandably, would think that sex therapy and working with sexuality the way that I do, it's about the sex and having better sex.
Mhm.
And that is a part of it, but it's such at a deeper level about meaning and spirituality, perhaps, or just a sense of who we are and how we live in our bodies and all of that. And so I think I'm always been someone who cares a lot about meaning.
Mhm.
And so my finding my way to this is a great place to be positioned, so to speak,
Yeah, yeah,
working with sexuality, but tapping into meaning. And that brings me to your work with this book, The Existential Importance of the Penis, a guide for understanding male sexuality.
yeah, yeah.
So I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about what inspired you first to write this book.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. In just the short pieces of conversation we've had so far, I think we look at these things very similarly in terms of sex and sex therapy. And it's one of the ways that I also distinguish between sex educators and sex therapists. The work of the sex educator, I think, is to educate people about sex and to maybe educate them about how to have better sex in some ways. I think the sex therapist, though, is much more of the psychotherapist. We are looking much deeper about what sex means to people, about what sexual function means to people, what makes it important. It's tempting to look at it on such a surface level that it's about sex, and of course, to some degree, it is, but it's also, especially when people are having difficulties sexually, it's usually about something that is much deeper and something that is much more meaningful. And so I've learned over the years, as I said before, I've been practicing clinical psychology and sex therapy for about 40 years now. And, I always knew that the people that I worked with who were experiencing sexual difficulties were suffering. I mean, it was obvious, like anybody who comes into therapy. They're in pain. That's primarily why people come into therapy. But it just always fascinated me, especially working with men. Most of I've done a lot of work with women. I've done a lot of work with couples. But most of my work has come from urologists. That's where I made my initial contacts. That's where most of my early networking, was directed. And so I saw a lot of men, a lot of male patients who were having sexual difficulties, and it was always fascinating to me the lengths that men would go through rather, in order to restore penile functioning. When you think about it, men who are willing to use these vacuum pump devices, which are so uncomfortable, that men would get penile prostheses, surgical implants, that later on, men would put needles, injections directly into their penises. I mean, this has to be about a lot more than just the ability to have sex. Because one of the things that we have talked about in sex therapy and sex education for so many years is that, sex doesn't have to be, with erections. You can have good sex, enjoyable sex, intimate sex, even if you can't have erections. But that was always a hard sell, to men and
So to
the
speak.
men that I've worked with. Yes, that's right. Yes, good one. But that was always, it was so difficult, to get these men on board and to accept that and be okay with that. And so I started to realize early on that there's more to it. I didn't necessarily know exactly what that was, but there is more to it. So I started in practice working from the way most sex therapists, especially these days, learn to work, is from some form of a CBT kind of background. I trained with Albert Ellis back in the day, who was just a brilliant, fascinating, clinician and theorist. People forget, that Ellis, while of course he's known for rational emotive or rational emotive behavior therapy now. Back in the day, it was just RET. Um, People forget that he was a pioneering sex therapist. He was there at the beginnings of ASECT and Quad S, and his early writings were all about sexuality and sex therapy and the treatment of sexual difficulties. So I learned a tremendous amount from him. And so for quite a few years, I practiced in that format, and it was very helpful for a lot of people. There's just no doubt about that. But it just didn't feel to me like it was really getting to the essence of the suffering that a lot of the men that I was seeing were experiencing. And then, in what I can only describe as a really life changing event, I found the work of Irvin Yalom, the existential psychiatrist from California, who was at Stanford at the time. And that work, his work, really, really resonated for me. It really grabbed me. And Yalom would certainly never describe himself as a sex therapist, but if you read his work, even his earliest book, his book on existential psychotherapy, which he wrote in 1980, is filled with case examples of people who came to see him for sexual difficulties. He treated a lot of sexual difficulties, and to me, I said, this really, I think, gets to the core of what I'm seeing. And so then I trained with Yalom, and that was life changing, not only in terms of the way I practiced, but in terms of the way I lived my own life. It was so impactful, to me working with him. So the book that I wrote was really an attempt to merge sex therapy with men with the work of Irv Yalom. And so I applied Yalom's existential psychotherapy principles to the practice of sex therapy. And he was really very, very supportive of the project. He went through all the chapters that I had written. He was just wonderful, in terms of making suggestions and being encouraging. So that's what made me decide to put this book together, because I thought, you know what, these are these are great times in sex therapy. It's these are fascinating times, because what's starting to happen is there's so much more integration now of psychotherapy theories and principles with sex therapy. Sex therapy, when Masters and Johnson began this, it was really kind of a standalone, kind of thing. Now, there's, people writing about narrative therapy and sex therapy, IFS, which I know you do, and sex therapy, somatic experiencing, and sex therapy, EFT and sex therapy, and my work now in existential psychotherapy. So I think these are great times for a book like this, and this is exciting for sex therapists.
I am excited to go in so many different directions right now because of what you're talking about integration and kind of
Mhm.
evolution of the field of sex therapy. And I know people listening to this podcast, some may be familiar with sex therapy and some may not. And even what is a sex therapist might be a question some people have.
Sure.
And
Mhm.
but I think you're giving great examples. So the way I practice, and I think you practice too, is from the frame of psychotherapy. There's other kinds of people that work with sexuality in different ways. Um, and I wanted to read something from your book because I thought it might
Mhm.
help people get a sense even further of where you're going here. And I think also it does echo a lot of the themes that those who are familiar with IFS work with a lot. So, this quote I'm going to read is from chapter 1, The Penis Speaks. And you're explaining the thesis of the book here. And you're saying that the essential thesis of this book is that the penis is a conduit for male emotion and thus regulates the closeness or distance that men will allow themselves to experience in intimate relationships. While men often pay a great deal of conscious attention to their penis, the unconscious messages our penis sends us can be much more profound and difficult to decipher. In this way, the penis speaks for many men who are dealing with repressed, unacknowledged, or unexpressed emotions. Of course, the penis doesn't actually speak, although it is often said in jest that the penis seems to have a mind of its own. Rather, it is the means through which we are being alerted that we are in a situation that doesn't feel safe, genuine, or secure. In other words, a central tenet of this book is the notion that our unconscious will speak to us through our penis and self protectively disrupt a sexual interaction due to some perceived danger or threat. Existentially, we are being alerted to a situation that imperils or jeopardizes our literal or emotional existence.
Yes, yes.
There's so much in that statement.
Yeah, and I think you're right. That statement kind of encapsulates the essence of the book and my understanding of sexual dysfunction and what goes into the treatment. Yeah,
So, if I could go through a few different pieces of that with you, it
yeah,
might be it might be interesting. Number one, actually, even the word sexual dysfunction, what makes for a dysfunction, and do you reframe it
yeah,
ever?
yeah. So people have said before, I've heard people talk about the word dysfunction as, maybe being kind of overly pathologizing. Maybe it's not the most helpful way to say it. And I understand that. And actually, I probably more often refer to it as sexual problems, sexual frustrations, even sexual inconsistencies. That create this distress for many of the people that we work with. Probably use the word dysfunction in the book because I do work with a lot of medical people, as I said, urologists in particular. It's the language that I often see in the sex therapy and the medical texts. But you're right, it may not be the best word to use, and sometimes it does have to be reframed. And I don't know that I use that term so much with the patients that I work with. I usually just talk to them less about, in sort of diagnostic terms and more in terms of, well, what do you think this is about? Why do you think this is happening? Why
Mhm.
do you think your body is reacting the way it's reacting? So I look at it more in terms of reactions to something as opposed to dysfunction, which I think is a medical model term.
Yeah. And and again, for folks that may not think about this or even maybe be around men who are having challenges with their penises a lot, I'm just
Hmm.
wondering if we could real quickly say some things like what are actually the functional problems people might be having, like can't get an erection, or they don't last as long as they want, or they come too
Hmm.
fast, or they come too slow. What might a guy be
Hmm.
experiencing that would cause him to wind up in your office?
So it's certainly the things that you mentioned, but there also are a lot of men who what on the surface anyway looks like a problem with low desire. But what I have found is that it's much more often an avoidance of partnered sexual activity than a true low desire. So many of the men that I see who are in partnered relationships but are not having sex within those relationships are having plenty of sex. And of course the initial assumption is that it would be outside the relationship, but it's not really. It's they have very robust masturbatory lives. I see a lot of men who have very, very active masturbatory lives that are in relationships but are not sharing their sexual lives with their partners.
Interesting.
Yeah.
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 So then that gets into this question of the penis as a conduit for male emotion and regulating closeness and distance in intimate relationships.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me sort of give kind of an example um, of what I typically see, how I typically think about it, and conceptualize it. So the work that so first let me explain, because a lot of people ask, well, what makes something existential? What is what what is that really about? So existential threats really refer to threats to our existence, things that somehow threaten our well-being, psychological or physical or relational. And the primary existential threats that Yalom talks about and that I address in this book are loss of meaning and purpose, um, the problems with freedom and responsibility, isolation, and the ultimate, of course, mortality. So, with those in mind, the approach that I use to sex therapy is also very trauma focused. So I am, and we may be getting a little bit ahead of where you want to go, but I'll come back to it later. But I am very critical of the typical performance anxiety theory of being an etiological factor in sexual dysfunction. Um, I believe that performance anxiety exists. I think that performance anxiety, may be a major factor in either people who have never been able to have successful sex, however they would describe that. In other words, maybe they're just too anxious and they just can't get there. And that's kind of always been that way. And I believe that performance anxiety may contribute to the maintenance of sexual difficulties. In other words, once somebody starts having trouble, then they start worrying and becoming anxious about having trouble going further. But the idea that performance anxiety is an etiological factor in the majority of sexual dysfunctions, which is what Masters and Johnson believed, which is what Helen Singer Kaplan believed, and which probably most every other sex therapist that I've ever spoken to believes, is actually a concept that has never really been tested or examined or critiqued.
So just to be
The,
clear for a second, you're saying here, Dan, that you recognize that many men might feel anxiety about their sexual performance, but that you don't feel like that's the root cause.
no,
The anxiety isn't the root cause. You see it as
no.
something deeper.
A- Absolutely. And I say that because most of the men that I have worked with, if you take a good history, they actually have a long history of very satisfying, successful sex. And oftentimes, even with the partner that they are currently having difficulty with. I mean, how many times in sex therapy do we hear somebody come in and say, yeah, sex used to be great, but all of a sudden I can't keep an erection, right? So, how could that be performance anxiety, right? Why would that creep in at that point in time? Why would somebody who has a good history of sexual functioning, especially with the partner that they are currently with, why would they develop performance anxiety at this point? To me, that makes no sense. So, to me, what I think we are often seeing is something that is much more the result of repressed or unacknowledged childhood trauma from a non sexual source. And what I mean by that is, sexual trauma, how that could disrupt sexual functioning. We all know about that, and that makes perfect sense, and that's pretty clear. But from an existential perspective, it's often the non-sexual traumas that get triggered that create sexual dysfunction. So let me give you an example. So when I talk about non-sexual traumas, I'm talking about those people who may have experienced early on in life some traumatic losses, abandonment, um, suffocation, or over control in their childhoods. And so, what tends to happen, and I think this is something that a lot of sex therapists don't pay enough attention to, is you want to know more about the timing that the problem began. And what you will often find is that sex was perfectly fine until there was some relationship deepening event, what I call a relationship deepening event. And so, as sex therapists, we often hear people come in and say, sex was great. And then we moved in together and I couldn't keep an erection. Sex was great. And then we got engaged or had got married or some other form of commitment. And then I couldn't keep an erection anymore, right? It's triggered by a relationship deepening event. And if you have early relational trauma, then what I believe happens is that as you get deeper into the relationship, there is a protective part of the unconscious that creeps in to protect you and says, this feels dangerous. This feels threatening. The more involved I am, the more likely I am to be hurt or abandoned or constrained and suffocated. And so what happens is, as a way to disrupt this connection from going deeper, The penis, in the case of men, speaks. It says, I'm not comfortable here. Something is frightening. Something is threatening here. And it shuts down. This is not performance anxiety. This is the triggering of early trauma. And if you also look at these cases that we see, most of the men, for example, and with the example of erection problems, we'll stay with that just for consistency, is they don't have trouble getting erections. And they don't have trouble maintaining erections for a long time. But once they go to intercourse, that's where they start to have a problem. Either just before intercourse, just before penetration, or just after penetration. That's when the penis shuts down. To me, that is much more complicated than performance anxiety. Why would performance anxiety creep in now? But why would the need to self protect from some existential threat to my existence? That to me makes a lot of sense. And I also draw heavily on the work of trauma psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk, who says that basically, trauma that is either repressed or unacknowledged, not dealt with, is going to reside in the body. And it is going to come out in some somatic way. To me, this is the perfect example of that.
This is amazing. And one of the main reasons I got excited about having you on the podcast, because without knowing it, you're kind of an IFS therapist.
Well, I think we're all a lot more similar than we are different. That's for sure.
Because we focus a lot on listening to the, kind of getting as consciously connected as we can to the whatever's distressing, the emotion or the physical symptom, and then relating with it, if we can get some space to bring some genuine curiosity to it.
Yes,
And then
exactly.
kind of like asking and listening. And in the system, we're often first running into what we call protector parts, right? And
Yes.
so this is just, but like with so much specificity in what you're bringing to this is something that I think is
Yeah.
very rarely explored or discussed in
Yeah.
in this world. But that I'm just guessing people will hear the overlap here, right? That there's a
Yeah.
protective function of some part, if I could use that parts language, some
Yeah.
part is turning something off as a protector because there's a fear of a tremendous, then we ask, well, what are you afraid of?
Right.
What are
Right.
you afraid of? And I
Yeah.
actually help people sometimes get into a bit of a dialogue with their penis or with their whatever the thing is that's going on.
Exactly. Exactly.
But and I don't want to divert you from where you're going, but I'm getting now curious. Like we're at this, it's like this drama. We're in this like moment now. Like there's this man and his wife, and he loves her, and he's like erect, and he's like wants to penetrate, and then like what is he feeling and thinking in that moment? Like what's like the terror? I guess like what is it
Right.
about that penetrative experience that you are perceiving is so threatening?
Yeah, and I would also add it that I have seen this in straight and gay couples. It's not just penile vaginal. It could be anal as well. I mean, I see this in gay couples as well as heterosexual couples. But I also just want to add that this now, I think, gets back to your earlier question about the reframing of dysfunction, right? Is that, it sounds like we both do this. It's like, it's important to understand what is your body telling you. In this case, what is your penis trying to say to you, right? To recognize that your penis is trying to protect you from something, then moves you into this exploration of, well, what might that be? Because most people, at least in my experience, they come into sex therapy not knowing why their bodies are not working the way they expect them to. They
Right.
really don't know. They'll try and come up with some post hoc kind of answers. And of course, performance anxiety is one that often gets thrown out there, right? But it never really resonates You can tell when an explanation sort of hits somebody where all, that sort of aha, moment. And when you can start to get them to think about what do you think you might be protecting yourself from?
Mhm.
Or what is your penis trying to say to you? When you uncover that correctly, you see it in people's eyes. Like
Mhm.
they say, "Oh my gosh, that makes so much sense to me." And that's when the work, really kicks in. And we were talking before about identity, and such. And one of the other differences I see between like the sex therapist and the sex educator is, as a sex therapist, I identify much more as a healer than an educator. Like, I'm not really there to teach people how to have better sex. I'm here to help them heal from whatever wounds are coming out, and then better sex follows in the
Mhm.
way they find it, not the way I prescribe it.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. So so I guess I'm still in this pregnant moment, if you will, of
yeah, yeah,
like being like what is it about,
oh yeah.
that moment
What about
of,
that moment?
is
Yes,
it
yes.
like of loss of, is it loss of all protection? Is there that moment of shared union that somehow melts the ego a bit? Like, what is your, like, that on an existential level? Is it the mini death? People have talked about orgasm as the mini death or the little
Yes,
death,
a little death.
like the
Yes,
little
yes,
death.
yes.
Like, I don't know if you can say anything about, and I'm sure it may not be the same, obviously, for everyone, but what is it about that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's interesting, and I'm not sure it's quite the same for everybody, but generally, I think that it's that awareness of deep connection, that penetration provides, that sets off what I sometimes refer to as this existential panic attack. And it is really kind of a metaphoric thing, right? Because, I mean, we can certainly say, well, that's not necessarily the deepest connection that people have. Some
Mhm.
people might find a deeper connection, certainly in non-sexual ways. But even if we're talking about sex, I mean, like, what's the difference for some people with, oral sex, for example? I mean, that's part of the body going into another part of the body. That's a connection there. But there is something that is deeply profound about genital connection. And from an existential standpoint, it may be that 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 is also, and I guess we're talking mostly now in a heterosexual way, that is sort of the life force, right? That here is where, life is created, right? And that next life is created, procreation, wise. And so that makes the consequences of penetration greater than any other type of connection in terms of opening up yourself in a vulnerable way, committing yourself in a deeply committed way. And so I think that's why that is usually the trigger point. That's when things really start to shut down,
Can
you
I
know.
jump in there for a minute? Because
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just enjoying sort of feeling into this a bit more, because I think there's something more mythic here too, like archetypal, right? Because even if someone knows they're not going to get pregnant, they're post menopausal, they're
Hmm.
not able to, get pregnant, or they're using contraception or whatever it is, and I think that's where maybe it expands even into other kinds
Right.
of genders, etc. There's something about the intimacy of that, I think. Like, and people can have penetrative sex without intimacy, right?
Absolutely. Oh,
So,
yeah,
and
of
often,
course.
But to like, so I guess then I'm getting curious there too. Like, if you see a difference in people who kind of keep those boundaries up and they're a little more protected or guarded or, a little more distant sexually,
Hmm.
and if they, would have the similar experience as someone who actually does want to open their soul, to the person that they're with.
Yeah. So it's it's also, it's a very interesting question. And there are so many uh, different ways to look. This is, one of the reasons I like existential therapy is because it does, part of what Yalom says is, therapy should be a new therapy for every person, right? He's very much against sort of the diagnosis and then, treatment based on diagnosis kind of protocols. And, again, that's heavily part of the medical model, but doesn't necessarily lend itself well to the psychotherapy model. And so, to me, you have to look at kind of, well, who is this person, and what are their existential issues? So, for example, it's going to be what threatens someone or threatens someone's existence is going to be different if their wounds have been more relational, and they fear intimacy. For others, the non-intimate connections often create, they may come from similar kinds of origins. It may have the same kind of childhood background, which has had trauma, but their response to it from the get-go is very different. In other words, they avoid intimacy because it's so threatening, to them. And so you're going to see oftentimes a different form of sexual difficulty in those who want intimacy versus those who sort of outwardly fear intimacy. So I'll give you an example, just a couple of examples.
Yeah, that's
So
great.
we've been talking about erection problems, right? And so there, I think oftentimes this is people who really, they want relationships and they're enjoying their relationship, and on the conscious level they want more. They want to go deeper, but that unconscious part of them protects them, so to speak, from going deeper by shutting them down.
Mhm.
You can contrast that with somebody whose difficulty is that during intercourse, they are unable to climax. They're unable to ejaculate and reach orgasm. Now, it's very rare. I mean, I've seen it, but it's very rare that this same person has this same difficulty during masturbation. During masturbation, they can usually climax fairly easily, right? Now, you know, the theory is, or at least has been, well, maybe they have some unusual or idiosyncratic masturbatory pattern that can't be replicated, with a partner, or, maybe they're just accustomed to a certain kind of touch that they can't replicate with a partner. It's possible, and I'm sure in some cases that is the case. But a lot of times, what you see are people who are existentially, again, sort of so fearful of the commitment and the deepening of the relationship that their unconscious, their self-protective unconscious holds them back. It will not allow them to give all of themselves. They hold back. Now, why does this happen? So I've seen this happen for many reasons, but one of the ones that I think a lot of people in sex therapy miss is that we treat a lot of what are sometimes referred to as these no sex relationships, which I alluded to before. Couples come in and they're distressed because they're not having sex, and they're not having sex because the male, if it's a heterosexual relationship, or one of the men, if it is a gay relationship, never wants to, never wants to. So the theory or the thinking is that this person has a low sex drive. What I find when I'm speaking to these men, as I said before, is that they actually have rather robust masturbatory lives. Their partners have no idea. Their partners have no idea of this. They think that they just don't have any interest in sex. And these men often say, yeah, I don't know. I just don't have much desire. I don't have much of a desire. But then you start to ask about masturbation, and they tell you that they actually, masturbate, several times a week, perhaps. And you start to question that whole thing about desire, right? So I have seen in a lot of men who hold back that they often grew up as what we sometimes refer to as parentified children, right? So I said that, one of the existential dilemmas that we look at is isolation. So there's isolation that we usually think about, people who are loners, people who are alone, people who, are disconnected from everybody. But there's a subset of that, which I write about, called isolation from the self. And these are people who really have no idea what they want, what they like. Because when they were kids, they spent so much energy and so much time taking care of the emotional needs of their caretaker, whether their caretaker, had some serious substance abuse problems, mental illness problems, personality disorder problem, whatever it may be. They actually became the adults in the relationship, always scanning the environment to see, you know, how is, mom feeling or how is dad feeling, and trying to do things to not set them off, to try and not upset them, or to try and help them. And this is at a time when most kids are focusing on themselves and learning about themselves and what pleases them and what's pleasurable to them. A lot of these people, as they get into adulthood, they find partnered sex way too anxiety provoking because they are so overly concerned about how is my partner doing that they completely, distance themselves from their own sexual feelings, their own sexual pleasure. And so eventually, in the beginning of the relationship, they're having sex all the time, which is part of what confuses people. They're having sex all the time. But as the relationship deepens, they start pulling back. They start pulling back because partnered sex becomes too uncomfortable for them. Masturbatory sex, solo sex, is the only time that they can allow themselves to focus on their own sensations because they're not having to worry about how's this other person doing. So that's another example of how connection and intimacy sometimes can cause people to hold back because of the trauma that they experienced when they were younger, that tells them letting yourself go, being too vulnerable, is dangerous. You will lose yourself.
So I'm all excited again listening because I feel those intersections with. I'm just, you have such a depth of experience working with men in these ways, and it's such an amazing window that you have into this and perspective on it. And it resonates so well with the work that I've been doing on what I call self-led sexuality. This
Mm,
model for self-led sexuality based in IFS, which
mhm,
is helping people to get to know these different parts of themselves. And then when those parts start to feel appreciated, they relax,
mhm,
and it opens up more access to one's self, real, we call it self or self energy, but like this core essential, nature that we have,
mhm,
that can be the location from which one navigates their sexual life. And
Yeah.
without an access to that, the sex can be just driven by these protector parts or these really wounded parts in
Hmm.
a way that does not feel very, I use these S words, it does not feel safe or sensual or spacious,
Yes.
et cetera. So I'm just, really hearing like corroboration
Yeah.
in a way that some of
Yeah.
my parts are saying. Um, but I see this in my caseload a lot, talking to, people of all genders, although I think it might manifest sexually a little differently for, in terms of where it comes in the process. But definitely men I've worked with who, yeah, there's no room for them, or it actually can get quite polarized, all or nothing. So there's either
Hmm.
they're not, I'm seeing what you're describing, like a real such a vigilance to pleasing a partner and watching and like being
Yeah.
afraid they're going to let them down. And the fear if they let them down is there's going to be some kind of rage coming at them,
Exactly.
right?
Yes.
And whether it's spoken
Yes.
or unspoken, some sense of failure or,
Yes.
like something terrible, something that feels terrible, to their
Yes.
vulnerable parts. And
Yes.
so that doesn't feel like a safe place to just really let go in, right?
It sounds like there's tremendous overlap in the way you do it and the way I do it. We may take a somewhat different course, or maybe there's a little different language, but it sounds like it's very, very similar and lots of overlap. And that's kind of what good therapy is, I think. And I also, though, I do want to point out, just so I don't get lost in this, is I wrote a book about men for a few reasons, um, but not because I don't believe that women have existential issues that manifest sexually. I just thought that as a cisgender male, I should be writing about men, and the inner lives of men. And it would be a bit presumptuous, to write about the inner lives of women. And I always have encouraged somebody else to do that. And finally, I sat on a dissertation committee of a woman who has done exactly that. She just passed her dissertation last week, and it was all about the existential sexuality of women, and it is a terrific project. She's going to hopefully turn that into a series of articles or a book, and it is very similar in a lot of ways, obviously, to men, but it's different. And I think it's good that it came from a cisgender woman instead of
Mhm.
me.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we have all the genders in between, right? Our,
Yeah.
non-binary and transgender people. And I think from what you're saying, it would be like, well, you're valuing people who identify in particular ways to explore how the existential issues manifest for themselves and the people that are,
Yes.
the most close to them in that way. But that it would be pertinent
Yes.
across the board.
Yes. Yes. Agreed.
Yeah,
Agreed.
awesome. Yeah, so I guess I do have a question then about working with people, the actual process, just
Uh-huh.
briefly of how you work with people, and it's psychotherapy and you're, talking and so forth. Do you find that when people connect the dots with insight, you know, that then that actually changes their sexual functioning?
I do. So let me speak a little bit more about that, because this is another way where I kind of veer in a somewhat different direction than the majority of sex therapists that I know of. So when I am working with someone, I actually don't take much of a sexual history. I take an extensive family history and developmental history, because what I'm looking for is not when did you first do this, or when did you first have this experience or that experience sexually. I want to know about the family and the environment that you come from, because I do believe that that is where the window into what what trauma are you is getting triggered will come from. So I do take a good history of the presenting problem. When did this begin? Under what circumstances? Tell me more about it, so I can understand. Sort of as I was saying, was there some relationship deepening event that triggered this response? But I actually spend a lot of time asking about family, background, childhood, growing up, what your experiences, were like. Because what I'm trying to do is connect those dots as this is what your penis is trying to alert you to. This is why your penis is shutting down, here, or this is why you're, sexually behaving this way, right? And once people have a narrative that makes sense to them, then the shift begins because if you again go back to the work of Bessel van der Kolk, once trauma is acknowledged, it loses a lot of its power. The body doesn't have to speak for you once you can speak for yourself, once you can identify and acknowledge. So it's helpful in that way. Um, I also think that just sort of that connecting the dots or that understanding helps people understand their lives better and how they want to manage their lives. So they actually then can start to put things into place that are more consistent with the kinds of lives that they want to be leading. They sort of stop getting in their own way, in a sense. People often ask me, well, don't you do any behavioral exercises? Is it all insight? And the answer to that is no. I mean, I actually do include behavioral exercises as well, but from my approach is, they are co-constructed behavioral exercises. So in other words, when I'm working with someone and we come up with this narrative that resonates for them, that sort of, creates that, aha, I understand. Then we start to talk about, so how would you like to approach changing this? How would you like to approach, getting this to happen? And we then co-construct what they might do in between sessions, in a behavioral way, either in individual therapy or in couples therapy, and go from there. I don't necessarily recommend, the exercises from, my own thinking, or things that they often write about in the sex therapy texts, because part of the existential philosophy is that we strive to be the authors of our own lives. And so it's important to me that people feel like they are creating what's going to happen going forward in their lives. So yeah. So the insight, I think, is a huge part of it. I think without that, the gains tend to be, much more tenuous and kind of not always very long lasting. But when you combine the insight then with sort of, okay, how are we going to move this forward?
Mhm.
That's where I think the sort of real substantial changes occur.
Yeah, I'm hearing in that like it's understanding, and then also maybe it introduces a level of self-compassion in a way, and can
Oh
kind of
yeah.
soften some of the shame or judgment around the difficulty.
Absolutely. What's sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, too, which is not so much the people whose sex becomes inhibited um, or compromised, but all those people whose sex becomes out of control. And I have a whole section in the book on the sort of problematic sexual behavior, the uncontrolled sexual behavior, and what that's really about from an existential perspective.
Mm.
And that's a whole other kind of phenomenon, but still triggered by an existential panic.
Could you really briefly share the story you had about the physician, the ER
Yeah.
guy?
Yes. I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, I remember that one. So so um, A lot of times I believe in and I have collected now literally well over 100 cases of people whose sexual behavior spiraled kind of uncharacteristically out of control following an experience of their own mortality or a closeness to death. Sex, as I said before, from an existential perspective, is a life force, right? It can create life, right? And so a lot of people, when they experience severe death anxiety or death terror, they will often turn to sex to quell that anxiety. So just as a quick example, and then I'll get to the case that you were asking about. Um, one of the most powerful, things that I can recall reading about was, a lot of people are familiar with the work of Elie Wiesel. And for those who are not, Elie Wiesel was a Holocaust survivor who spent his entire life educating people about the Holocaust, to be sure that people never forget. So in his book, and he's written many books, but in his book Night, which may be the best known of his books, where he writes about being on the train to Auschwitz, and he's on the train, they're packed in, this is not like riding on an Amtrak train. These are cattle cars. People are just, jammed in there, and they're really crowded in these trains. They're on their way to Auschwitz. They know where they're going. They know what awaits them at the end of the line. And yet many people on the train were having sex. I can guarantee you it's not because they thought this was a romantic moment or even a sexually arousing moment. But in the face of death, people often turn to sex. And you don't see a lot of this in the sex therapy literature, but you see this in general literature all the time. Hemingway, Philip Roth, Dickens, they all write about people who turn to sex in the face of a confrontation with mortality. So the case that you were asking about, or the story that you were asking about, was I do a lot of forensic work as well, and the forensic work that I do in the last 20 years or so focuses mostly on doing evaluation and treatment for those licensed professionals in healthcare who cross sexual boundaries, with their clients or patients. So, I do a lot of work with physicians, psychologists, social workers, nurses, dentists. I do a lot of work for the licensing boards of people who have complaints filed against them because they become sexual, with their patients. Well, a few years ago, I started to see this huge increase of physicians becoming very sexualized in the hospital in ways that were problematic, but also very uncharacteristic. In other words, a lot of people who come in for treatment for what's sometimes called sexual addiction or sexual compulsion, or whatever you want to call it. The question that a lot of therapists don't ask is, when did this begin? Because they weren't always this way. Most of them were not always this way. It's like something happens and then they sort of, spiral out of control. So this particular ER physician, who'd been working in the hospital, actually he was an ICU physician, who'd been working in the hospital for many, many years, a couple of decades, without, any difficulties at all of a sudden started becoming very sexual with nurses and other staff, sort of propositioning people for sex, trying to grab at people and pull them into closets for sex, et cetera. He had never done anything like this before. This was so uncharacteristic. And it was somebody who was very well respected in the hospital. But all of a sudden, this was happening a lot. And he had no idea why. That complaints were filed against him. He really had no idea why. He was so perplexed. He said, I've never done this before. I don't know but I cannot stop. This was during the early days of COVID, when physicians in the hospitals were seeing people dying left and right. Nobody knew what to do. Nobody really knew what was happening. We forget now what those early days of COVID were like and how frightening they were. You didn't want to pass people on the street. We had no idea how this was this was communicated. But and I said, I saw like a huge rise in these cases from other physicians as well. Started seeing people dying in horrific ways. And I don't just mean horrific from the disease part of it, although that certainly was horrific enough. But if you remember, people couldn't have visitors in those early days of COVID. People were dying and saying goodbye to their families via iPads, FaceTime. It was terrible for the families and for the people. And what he started to see which was a little different from what he usually saw in the ICU, were his peers, people his own age. In some cases, in the story you're talking about, people he knew. I think in this particular case, it was the wife of his best friend. I think. Anyway, it was this confrontation with mortality that brought it close to him. When we deal with death, part of what we deal with is not just the sadness of losing a person, but depending upon who that person is in terms of age, for example, it brings it closer to our own mortality. When you lose a peer, yes, it's upsetting that you lose a peer, a friend, but it also reminds you that that could be me. I start to feel vulnerable. My own mortality on some level is confronted. And so what was happening for him was he was overwhelmed with death. And it felt so close to him. And his response to it was kind of like what Elie Wiesel described on the train to Auschwitz, was a sexual explosion, turning to sex to try and quell the fear of death. He said he would go home at night and just spend the night in tears, just crying. He'd been an ICU physician for years. He'd seen people die all the time, but not like this. And he never felt so vulnerable. So that's what and so, as I said, I've collected now well over 100 cases of
Mm,
people who had some type of close confrontation with death
yeah.
that triggered their own fears of mortality, and they sexually went off the rails.
So that's a very powerful story. And, I just even invite listeners to notice how that lands like in and around your body. In fact, I haven't asked people to check in since the beginning, but this is bringing, this conversation may bring up some of those fears and feelings. And I wonder if you have like a quick, like, what happened for that guy? Like when you worked with him, was he able to gain
Yeah.
insight? Did that process happen where he was able to,
Yes. 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 So
recover?
yeah. So first of all, yeah, as I tell that story, I feel it myself.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can feel the agitation.
Yeah, yeah. I
As
mean, you're a
as I
dramatic
tell those
storyteller,
stories.
which I love stories. So, but I'm like right with you in there. It's like it's very dramatic. So I'm right in there. So now I'm like, don't leave me hanging here.
All right, so the bottom line is, yes, he did very well. Um, and part of it, of course, is because we got a better handle on COVID. But his own death anxiety, we were able to process much more. And excuse me, a lot of times what you see, which is what you see with this gentleman, is that they had some early death experiences themselves. Lost a parent who was very young, for example, is not uncommon. And so that creates a vulnerability that they often didn't even know was there.
Mhm.
And so when this was happening in the hospital, it really sort of, not only was it confronting him with death in real time, but it was also triggering fears and anxiety about mortality from, from childhood. So we were able to, again, the therapy was deep. It was helpful. It allowed him to process his own fears about his own mortality currently, as well as sort of repair some of the damage from early experiences with death. But one of the things that is important from the existential approach here is that existential therapists actually believe that it's good to be aware of death, that it's important to think about death. A lot of times, a lot of people will say, if you say to somebody, well, I'm just so afraid I'm going to die, or so, people will say, well, don't think about that, or don't think that way, or think positively, or whatever. Yalom has a quote, which I love, where he says, while the physicality of death destroys us, the idea of death may save us. And what he means by that is the idea of death, recognizing that death is inevitable, recognizing that death is out there for all of us and we never know when, can actually be a great motivator to take charge of your life, to not wait, to not put things off, to actually say, that I can't act as if I have forever, and that life is a never-ending upward spiral. I have to actually be focused on the fact that life is short. Any way you cut it, it's short. And it can be a great motivator to live as best as you can with as few regrets as possible. One of the things that Yalom writes about, and that certainly I have noticed, and a lot of people have noticed, is that those people who have lived well, they age much better. They don't fear aging. They don't fear death the same way. They have lived lives that are full. Those who have the most difficulty are those who have not, who have regrets about what I haven't done yet, that I'm afraid of running out of time. And this brings me back to we all learn this, although we never really figure out how to apply it. Is the work of Eric Erickson, who talked about this stuff a long time ago. Each stage of life is supposed to be different, right? And at the later stages, you want to look back and evaluate your life. And if you can look back and evaluate it and be pleased, you are going to age much better than if you look back and evaluate it and have regrets. So existential therapists talk about death a lot. We want people to think about death. We want them to be aware of the fact that, yes, you could die,
Mhm.
but that's a good thing, not a bad thing. And I don't mean like a good thing like people want to die, but we're all going to. Like, it's not like, well, maybe it won't happen to you. No, it will. It will. And so when you get there, you want to be able to get there and be happy about the life you've led, not regretful.
Very powerful. Yeah. So much to take in there, right? And we're, depending, and people, listeners may be in different parts of the world, different cultures that have different relationships to death and talking
Mhm.
about death and facing death and
Yes.
easing death or, not offering help to people who are dying. There's so many things but
Yes.
one thing I want to share with you is that when I decided to become a sex therapist, I was working in elder care and hospice. So I was
Ah,
simultaneously by day doing hospice work and taking my sex therapy courses, in the evening.
interesting.
And
Yeah. How about that?
just always felt like it's all connected, right? Sperm to worm or whatever people want to say about that, womb to tomb. Like we
Sperm to worm, I never heard. I like
uh,
that.
we're sexual beings and we're, our life. forces with us, but there's in this incarnation, in this human form at least, there's a beginning, and an end. And knowing that, I believe, can be so empowering. And then from an IFS perspective, being with our parts who maybe do have fear and anxiety about that.
Hmm.
And, living well might be external, notching off, certain material
Hmm.
successes. But it more often, I think, in the end, feel is a lot more about, how do you feel on the inside, in terms of
Hmm.
meaning and relationship and connection, or just using, the capacities that you came into this world with. So
Hmm. Yeah.
amazing. Yeah. So I wanted to make just another point for listeners that we don't want to forget about, and I'm not saying you're forgetting about it, but I think you're
Hmm.
steeped in this so much that there can be medical issues that are
Oh,
impacting
yes.
the functioning of the penis.
Yes.
So we never want to like kind of engage with someone who's having a significant difficulty that's physical without ruling out that there could be some kind of medical factor contributing as well.
100%. Yeah. Almost everybody like I said, most of the people that I see have come from urologists, so they've had a medical, evaluation. But for those who haven't, it's usually a good idea, to check that out. But you did remind me of something else too, which is that, these existential issues come up even for people whose problems are not psychological in origin, but are medical that creates psychological. Like, for example, I do a lot of work with prostate cancer patients. That after treatment for prostate cancer, they're not getting erections anymore, and they feel like they have a confrontation with mortality. You know, Working with them not to restore the functioning of their penis, but to help them deal with the fact that yeah, this is an indicator that we are vulnerable people, and that for them, a lot of men after prostate cancer describe themselves as feeling lifeless, like the life is drained out of them, you know. So the medical part of this is important, both in terms, as you said, about just sort of being sure that when we're treating somebody, we've been thorough in doing our assessment to be sure that there's not some medical issue that needs to be treated, and then that would resolve the sexual difficulties. But also, a lot of people who have medical issues that impact their sexuality have lots of existential concerns about their own vulnerability and mortality
Yes, and identity, and
and identity.
who am I? Do I have
Yeah,
potency as a human being if I don't experience sexual potency in the same way as I did
absolutely.
before? Mhm.
It's a life force. It's a life force. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, this has been such a rich, fascinating conversation, and I just wanted to see if you wanted to let people know how they could, in addition to this book, which we'll have in the
Hmm.
show notes,
Oh, great.
how might people find you, or find your work?
So the book is easy to get. Of course, it's published by Routledge. So the Routledge website, but Amazon is probably where most people get it. They have a good price, and so you can certainly do that. But also, I have a website. If you just sort of search my name, you'll find lots of different ways to contact me, either by email or phone. And I'm certainly eager to hear from anybody who has some thoughts about this or some questions about this. So I would encourage people to do that. But I would also just say, if what I'm talking about is interesting, read some of Yalom's work. Read Love's Executioner, read The Gift of Therapy, and if you really want to do a deep dive, you can read Existential Psychotherapy or Staring at the Sun. But I just think his work is so impactful on a professional and a personal level. So, that would be my number one recommendation.
Awesome. And I do like to ask my guests before we end if you could share something that you personally find pleasurable in life.
Oh yeah. Well, as I said in the beginning, family. I really am very very fortunate and love being with family. But I am also a musician, and I love music. And I'm a guitar player since 1964. Um, when the Beatles came on Ed Sullivan. That was uh, that was so impactful for me, and so I've been playing ever since then, and I love it. And I play for myself. I play out. I do gigs. So that's a great pleasure for me.
Hmm. That's great. I see the guitars in your background
Do
there.
you see them there? Yeah,
Yes, yes,
yeah.
they clued me in
Yes.
early that you were a musician.
Yeah. I have quite a collection of guitars. I do.
Hmm. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much,
You're
and
welcome.
we'll say goodbye for now, and maybe we'll do another round sometime.
That would be terrific. Thank you. I enjoyed it very much. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to the Self-Led in Bed podcast. Check us out at www.patriciarich.com/podcast, where you can sign up for a free guide to the 6 S's of sexual self-energy. And if you liked this episode, please subscribe and share it with a friend. Until next time.